Okay guys, in this topic we're going to talk about gas exchange in insects. Now, when we talk about gas exchange, it's really important to use what's called Fick's law. So there's some ideas about efficient gas exchange through diffusion, and we'll be talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide gases. So Fick's law, and we should always refer to this when we talk about gas exchange in any type of organism. It really says that the rate of diffusion is increased of oxygen or carbon dioxide in the opposite direction across the gas exchange surface when there's a large surface area. So the gas exchange surface in an insect is the tip of the tracheole. So the tracheole is the needle-like tube at the end of the trachea that branch off from the trachea. So a big surface area to maximize the rate of diffusion times a big concentration gradient of oxygen or carbon dioxide in the opposite direction. So there's a bit of fluid at the tip of the tracheole that dissolves the oxygen gas, and the oxygen then diffuses across the very thin wall of the tracheole into the muscle cell or the respiring cell, and it gets used up straight away because we know oxygen is the final electron acceptor inside the mitochondria and it forms water, H2O. So as the oxygen gets used up inside the mitochondria of the cells, it creates that nice concentration gradient. So lots of oxygen gas diffuses to the tip of the tracheole, and it's going to get used up in aerobic respiration. So there's a higher to lower concentration gradient. Now, what we want is the wall of the tracheoles are very thin. So we want the smallest possible diffusion distance. Let me just extend that a bit. So the rate of diffusion of oxygen or carbon dioxide in the opposite direction across the gas exchange surface is going to be increased when there's a bigger surface area. So the tracheoles collectively, there's millions of these needle-like thin tubes, very big surface area for gas exchange. There's a big concentration gradient of oxygen from higher to lower, so that's going to maximize the rate of diffusion, and there's a short diffusion distance because the wall of the tracheoles is very thin. So we're going to call it a tracheal system. Now, insects have no hemoglobin, they have no blood as such, and they've certainly got no red blood cells. So insects, we can say, have no hemoglobin, they've got no red blood cells, and they've got no blood as such. Now, you might see insect blood in some questions, but what it's really referring to is a thing called hemolymph. Now, hemolymph is a fluid that you find in the hemocoel of an insect, the cavity inside an insect, and that contains glucose and amino acids and ions and water, but it certainly isn't anything to do with oxygen. So the tracheal system in an insect is what we're really interested in when we're talking about gas exchange. So there's no hemoglobin, there's no red blood cells, and there's no blood. So what is the tracheal system then? Well, if we have a look at an insect, there's three body parts of an insect. There's the head, there's the thorax, and then the third section of any insect, the basic body plan, is going to be the abdomen. So we could say head, thorax, and abdomen. Now, down the length of either side of the thorax and the abdomen, you have these little muscular valves called spiracles. So either side like this. Now, the muscular valves, the spiracles, can open and close, and that's really important because when they're open, it allows oxygen gas to diffuse into a trachea, and the trachea then branches into needle-like tracheoles, which allows the O2 gas to diffuse to the tip of the tracheole, which is the gas exchange surface. Now, obviously, when they are open, it allows the exit by diffusion of carbon dioxide, which is a waste gas from aerobic respiration, and that comes from the link reaction in the Krebs cycle inside the mitochondria of the respiring cells. So the actual gas exchange surface then is definitely not the spiracles. Okay, the spiracles can open and close. They are muscular valves, and they are really important because they allow the diffusion of O2 gas into the trachea, and they allow the CO2 gas to diffuse the opposite way. Now, because they're valves, they can open and close. So the spiracles, when they close, obviously there's going to be no more oxygen coming in by diffusion into the trachea, but it prevents excessive water loss. So when the spiracles close, it means there's reduced water and reduced heat loss. So they have to be able to close to prevent too much water vapor loss and too much heat loss from inside the insect. But when they are open, obviously we are going to allow eventually gas exchange to take place. So the trachea then is a tube, and it's lined with chitin. So oxygen gas can simply diffuse as a gas, so it's not dissolved in any liquid or blood or anything like that. There's no respiratory pigment. It simply diffuses as a gas through the open spiracles down the trachea, and then this trachea will branch into many needle-like tracheoles like this. So at the tip of the tracheole is a little volume of fluid. So here we could say the tracheoles, and this is the tip of the tracheole, and there is a fluid. So the O2 gas can then dissolve in this fluid, and then it simply diffuses across the thin wall of the tracheole into the respiring cells. So this might be a muscle cell, and therefore the oxygen is going to be used in aerobic respiration to make some ATP to allow that muscle cell to contract, for example. So there's no blood, there's no respiratory pigment. The O2 gas simply diffuses down to the tip of the tracheole, and this is the important bit, the gas exchange surface. So it's between the tip of the tracheole and the respiring cell, and obviously the tip of the tracheole's got a very thin wall. It's very close to the respiring cell, so there's a short diffusion pathway for oxygen to diffuse into the muscle cell where it gets used up. However, this is the scenario when the insect at rest. So we know insects have two pairs of wings and they can fly, and if they fly, that means they need more muscle contraction, which is going to require a bit more oxygen for aerobic respiration, because that makes the ATP needed for muscle contraction. So what happens then, if we go back to this scenario on the left here, during flight, so let's just put that here, when the insect is more metabolically active, it requires more oxygen because it requires more aerobic respiration to make more ATP. So the abdomen can ventilate the tracheoles. So what happens during flight is the abdomen gets bigger. Now, as the abdomen gets bigger, so let me just put abdomen. The volume of the abdomen increases, and what that does, it lowers the pressure inside the abdomen here. So this is the abdomen. So as the volume gets bigger of the abdomen, the pressure inside the abdomen decreases. Now, what that's going to do is these abdomen spiracles are actually closed to start with, but the thorax spiracles are open. So air is going to be drawn in down a pressure gradient through the open thorax spiracles. So air is going to be drawn in by a pressure gradient through these thorax spiracles. and air moves in down from higher to lower pressure through the open thorax spiracles, down the trachea and to the tip of the tracheoles. And then what happens is these are actually closed at this stage, but we're going to get gas exchange at the tip of the tracheoles inside the insect. The abdomen then does the opposite. So the abdomen decreases in size. And what that does, that decreases the volume of the abdomen, and that's going to increase the pressure of the air within the trachea of the abdomen. So these thorax spiracles then close, and when this second process occurs here, so the abdomen's getting smaller, the volume's decreasing inside the abdomen, the pressure's increasing inside the abdomen, these abdomen spiracles then open, and it forces the air with carbon dioxide in it out of the open spiracles along the length of the abdomen. So this is going to draw in, number one at the top, fresh air with more oxygen in it. And then as the abdomen decreases in size, the abdomen spiracles open, the thorax spiracles close, and that's going to force air out that contains the waste gas, which we know is carbon dioxide. Now, if we go back up to the trachea and the tracheoles, we know that the trachea aligned with a carbohydrate polysaccharide called chitin. Now, chitin you also find in the exoskeleton of the insect, so it has a skeleton on the outside of its body, and all the internal organs are actually attached to the underside of the exoskeleton. It's very similar to cellulose, so it's made of straight chains, it's a polysaccharide. The monomer isn't beta-glucose, it's a modified version of beta-glucose, and it has got nitrogen in the monomer. There are glycosidic bonds that allow the monomers to link together in a straight chain. Remember, a bit like cellulose, the straight chains are cross-linked by hydrogen bonds, and a collection of straight chains of chitin is, it's called, very similar to a microfibril that you find in the cellulose cell wall. Now, the chitin is super important because what happens is it provides mechanical support for the trachea and the tracheoles, and it prevents this from collapsing inwards when the air is pulled in down a pressure gradient. Now, the actual wall of the tracheoles are very thin, and that goes back to Fick's law that we had at the top, which is really important because it provides a short diffusion distance for gas exchange. So anytime you're going to talk about diffusion or rates of diffusion, you need to mention gas exchange and oxygen as well. Now, one other thing is during flight, the fluid at the tip of the tracheole, it actually reduces in volume. And that's because there's a slight buildup of lactic acid in the muscle cell. Now, lactic acid is soluble in the cytoplasm of the muscle cell, so it lowers its water potential slightly, and that pulls in some of the water from the fluid at the tip of the tracheole by osmosis, and that's down a water potential gradient. Now, that allows more oxygen gas to be drawn in towards the tip of the tracheole, and then it can still dissolve and it can diffuse into the muscle cell. So we've got a combination of aerobic respiration going on to make more ATP, and a little bit of anaerobic respiration when the muscles are, in use and being used very rapidly during muscle contraction and flight.